This is the Grind It Podcast. We know just like grinding a handrail or across a coping can be challenging at times, so can life be. We share God's Word and personal stories to encourage you to keep grinding and to not give up. It's time to grind. So here's the old school skateboarder himself, Randall Tucker. Welcome to the Grind It Podcast. Today we're going to start breaking down Matthew chapter 19. And Matthew chapter 19 is probably known for the divorce content because the Pharisees come to Jesus asking about divorce, but what that really is just a surface issue. The deeper issue with Matthew chapter 19, which goes way beyond the divorce issue, is the heart of the person. But the first part of this chapter starts out with the Pharisees asking Jesus a question about divorce. So that's what we're going to cover today. In Matthew 19, 1 through 11, Matthew writes this. He says, "When Jesus had finished saying these things," talking about forgiving others from the previous chapter, chapter 18. We've covered that in the previous podcast. If you haven't heard those, go back and listen to those first, then come back to this. "But when Jesus had finished saying these things," talking about the forgiveness of others and how necessary it is, "he left Galilee and he goes down to the region of Judea east of the Jordan River." And Matthew says large crowds followed him there and he healed their sick, as he always did. He just met people's needs constantly. Verse 3, "Some Pharisees came and tried to trap him," and there's part of the key right there. They're trying to trap Jesus. They always tried to trap Jesus, and they would always come to him and question him about something because they were trying to get people to not believe in Jesus, to discount Jesus as being the Messiah. And so Matthew says that some Pharisees came and they tried to trap Jesus with this question: should a man be allowed to divorce his wife for any reason? And Jesus answers this way. He says, "Haven't you read the scriptures? They record that from the beginning, God made them male and female. And he said, this explains why a man leaves his father and mother and is joined to his wife. And the two are united into one. Since they are no longer two, but one, let no one split apart what God has joined together." So Jesus gives them and us God's heart and God's will when it comes to marriage. A man leaves his father and his mother and he is joined, he is literally glued to his wife in marriage. The two people have come together, they consummate their marriage, they've had sex on their honeymoon, and the two are now one. They are united. They are a unit. They are glued together, and they should not be separated by anything or anybody. That's God's will. That's the heart of God when it comes to marriage. A man leaves his mother and his father, and he has found a woman, opposite sex, a man and a woman, and the two come together as one. They are a unit, and they should act and live accordingly. And that's not always easy to do, and it takes a lot of work. But these two, the man and the woman, they're no longer two separate people with two different driving forces, but they have now become one, and they're working together in unity, or at least they should be. And Jesus says, let no one split apart what God has joined together. That is the absolute heart of God when it comes to marriage. Period. Point blank. But the problem is man's heart. That is the deeper issue. And that's every time the Pharisees come to Jesus, there's always a deeper issue, and that's what Jesus is going to address every time these Pharisees come to Jesus trying to challenge him with an issue. The deeper problem is the heart. There's always something on the surface that they come with, like marriage. And Jesus always goes deeper with his answers, and he's looking at the heart. The heart of man is always at the heart of any issue, in my opinion. We are selfish. We have baggage from our past, from our childhood, both men and women, and we bring all of this junk, all of this baggage into the marriage. And instead of dealing with all the junk, far too often people decide it's not worth it. It's too much work. And what they think is, I'll just go find me a better mate, a better helper somewhere else. But what they see the grass is greener, as the saying goes, on the other side. But what they don't understand is that's artificial grass on the other side. That's what we used to call in the old days artificial turf. It's not even real. That's why it's so green. And they think, this is such a struggle with this marriage, I'll just go find somebody else. But what they don't realize is that other person has junk too. And if it's not dealt with properly, both people bring this junk into the marriage, this luggage that they've drugged from their childhood and their upbringing and their backgrounds. And if they don't deal with that in a proper way, it's always going to follow them no matter what relationship they're in, no matter who they are with. It has to be dealt with. That's why marriage counseling is always good. If you're not married and you're planning on getting married, go see a marriage counselor or see a pastor and get some marriage counseling before you even get married. To see what deep issues are coming into this marriage that need to be worked on before the marriage. Because once you're in the marriage, according to what Jesus says, hey, you're in it. You're in it. So it's always better to stick with God's plan than it is to go with man's plan. But I will admit that there are times when divorce is unavoidable. And there are times when divorce is permitted. But that's another deep study for a podcast on another day. I just want to stick with what's going on here in Matthew chapter 19. And the issue is with these Pharisees is that they wanted to trap Jesus. And what better way to trap Jesus than to compare what he says to the one who actually gave the law to the Jews, who is Moses, right? Because Moses visited God on Mount Sinai. God gives Moses the law, the 10 commandments, and Moses brings it down the mountain and shares it with the people. And so Moses is the religious leader's authority. Moses and the law is how the Jews and Judaism, it was the heart of Judaism. It's how that was the base of their religion. And so their religion is based off of works. And so since God had given these directions to Moses specifically, well, hey, here's this guy who's claiming he's the Messiah. We'll just compare what, if he's from God, then what he says ought to match up with Moses, right? So that's the issue going on here with the Pharisees. They're wanting to trap Jesus, and they're going to use the law of God, which what they don't realize is Jesus was there when God gave the law to Moses. Jesus wrote that law, but they don't understand that. But they're trying to use the law and what Moses said to trap Jesus because they don't believe that he's the Messiah, right? So they say in verse 7, then why did Moses say in the law that a man could give his wife a written notice of divorce and send her away? And Jesus replied, Moses permitted divorce only as a concession to your hard hearts, but it was not what God had originally intended. That's what Jesus says. So this is the heart of the matter. Divorce is a heart issue. It's a heart issue. The Pharisees claim Moses allowed divorce for any reason. And there's no way to prove this because there's no examples in the Bible. And if there's something out there outside the Bible, I don't know of it. So I can't prove this in a biblical sense. But I just wonder how many of these Pharisees have been divorced and remarried. Maybe it's several times. Because, hey, this wife wasn't pleasing them. She wasn't giving them everything they needed, and so they find some way to divorce this woman and go for the greener grass. You know, they like that grass in the neighbor's yard. That neighbor's wife is treating him a whole lot better than his wife, so we're going to pursue her and go for that greener grass. Now, like I said, I can't prove that biblically, but maybe that's what's going on here. I don't know. But the heart of the matter is literally the heart of man. Divorce is not the issue. The heart is the issue. But they're going to pin Moses against Jesus and Jesus against Moses, and they're going to try to trap Jesus, comparing the answer that Jesus gives to what Moses said in the law. So we need to know what Moses actually said in the law, and we find that in Deuteronomy 24, verses 1 through 4. And this is what Moses says. Suppose a man marries a woman, but she does not please him. Having discovered something wrong with her, he writes a document of divorce, hands it to her, and sends her away from his house. When she leaves his house, she is free to marry another man. But if the second husband also turns against her, writes a document of divorce, hands it to her, and sends her away, or if he dies, the first husband may not marry her again, for she has been defiled. The problem is she gets a written divorce from her husband, her first husband, and she goes and remarries. And she's had sex and has had a relationship. She has become one with another man, right? And that man finds something wrong with her or divorces her for some other reason. She can't go back and remarry her first husband according to what Moses says here in Deuteronomy. That's what Moses is saying, because he says that would be detestable to the Lord. And you must not bring guilt upon the land the Lord your God is giving you as a special possession. So Moses is saying we got to keep the land pure. God has given us this promised land. We're heading toward it, and we want to keep that land pure. We want to honor God. And so that's what Moses is saying in just a little nutshell, not going into too deep into that, what he's saying. And so I got the digging into this a little deeper, and I'm still going to just keep it surface level and try to help you understand what's going on. But the Jewish religion, which is Judaism, there's basically two schools of thought. You have the house of Hillel and the house of Shammai. The house of Hillel is more lenient and tolerant with their ideas and their interpretation of the law, whereas the house of Shammai was more strict when it came to their interpretation of the law. And there's over 300 disputes between these two schools of thought, and one of those is this idea behind divorce. What is Moses saying there in Deuteronomy 24, 1 through 4? The house of Shammai held that a man may only divorce his wife for a serious transgression. So you can see the strictness there, the strictness of their interpretation. But the house of Hillel, he allowed divorce for little things, such that this woman has bugged this man. She has burnt the biscuit. She has overcooked the meal, or just some little petty thing. She didn't clean the house the way that he thinks that she should. So Shammai says a man can only divorce his wife for a serious transgression, such as immorality, infidelity. But the house of Hillel says you can divorce for anything. And so these Pharisees who are trying to trap Jesus, obviously they sided with the thoughts of Hillel because they took the view that Moses was saying they could divorce for any reason. And here's the issue that's going on here. The Pharisees are looking for ways around adultery. If they saw some good-looking woman over there that was better, that was way better looking than what they had at home, well, then they wanted a way out so they could pursue the greener grass, like I mentioned a while ago. So to get around adultery in a legal sense, because that's what the law dealt with and what the Pharisees were concerned with, what Moses said and what God's law said, because that is their authority. Keep that in mind. And so they wanted to get around adultery in a legal sense, and they wanted to keep the law as well as their traditions. So they come up with an interpretation of the law so that they'll still be in good standing with God. They did this all the time, like the washing of the hands. When they come to Jesus, it says, "Why did your disciples not wash their hands before ceremonially before they eat a meal?" That wasn't in the law. That was a part of their oral traditions, the way they interpreted the law, which they made their interpretation of the law as equal to the law. And that's what's going on here. They're trying to find a way around adultery and still be in good standing with God. And if you think about it, we do the same thing today in our day and time. Not just people who are following God, but just people in general. They'll say something like this: "Oh, that scripture doesn't say that. It says this." Or we'll take a verse out of context and we'll twist a certain verse, or when we take it out of context, we can make it say whatever we want to. And so we come up with this different meaning for this particular verse, so it satisfies our guilty conscience, or it satisfies the choices that we have made to live in sin. And so to make ourselves feel better, to convince ourselves that we're not living in sin, that we're living a righteous life according to God's word, we pull scriptures out of context and we twist the meaning of scriptures. And so what we're trying to do is gratify our sinful hearts. And it doesn't work that way. And that's what's going on with the Pharisees here. And Jesus is addressing what is the actual heart of the matter, and that is the heart of the Pharisees. He has made it clear that the Pharisees' hearts are far, far away from God. Even though they looked the part, they dressed the part, they sounded the part, everybody, even the disciples, they would see the Pharisees and they had so much respect for them, they thought they were just holy people. And Jesus says, no, their hearts are far from God. And he would warn them over and over again, don't be like the Pharisees. And so in verse 7 of Matthew 19, they said, why did Moses say in the law that a man could give his wife a written notice of divorce and send her away? And Jesus replies, Moses permitted divorce only as a concession to your hard hearts, but it was not what God had originally intended. That's the issue here. You people, you men, your hearts are hard. You say you're after God's own heart, but you're not. You're selfish, and you want to gratify your selfish desires. And so you go for this greener grass. You just divorce this woman and go find another woman. And that's not what God originally intended when it comes to marriage. But Jesus takes it a step further in verse 9. He says, I'll tell you this. Whoever divorces his wife and marries someone else commits adultery unless his wife has been unfaithful. So Jesus not only answered their question, but as he always does when it comes to the Pharisees, he exposes their hearts and their hypocrisy. And he takes it a step further and he goes deeper, and he literally just gut punches the Pharisees. He just smacks them in the face, if you will, with the truth. And he says, I tell you, whoever divorces his wife and marries someone else commits adultery unless his wife has been unfaithful. Because he's already told the Pharisees, he said, God's desire is for one man and one woman to come together and be united as one. They're one unit. They're working in unity. That's God's desire. And he says, don't let anybody separate what God has joined together. That is the heart of God. And he says, And you Pharisees, you're asking me about marriage here. If you divorce your wife for any other reason except for infidelity, then you're committing adultery. Adultery is one of the 10 commandments, right? The 10 commandments is what the Pharisees and the Jews and their religion, Judaism, that's what they hung their hats on, if you will. The law was everything to the Jews and to the religious leaders, and especially the Pharisees. They tried to follow the law to a T. They tried to dot their I's and cross their T's, if you'll let me say that, as well as their interpretation of the law, like I mentioned a while ago, and their traditions. But now Jesus, if you let me say this, he just throws a right-hand hook, and he connects to their chin and just about knocks them out when he says, if you divorce for any reason besides infidelity, you've committed adultery. If you remarry another woman, he says you've committed adultery. You have broken God's commandment, one of the 10 commandments. In verse 10 of Matthew 19, it says, Jesus' disciples then said to him, if this is the case, it's better not to marry. Not everyone can accept this statement, Jesus said. Only those whom God helps. Some are born eunuchs. Some have been made eunuchs by others. And some choose not to marry for the sake of the kingdom of heaven. Let anyone accept this who can. A eunuch is somebody who has lost their penis for whatever reason. That's why he says some were born as eunuchs. Some have been made eunuchs. They were castrated. And some choose not to marry for the sake of the kingdom of heaven. And that is the goal. The kingdom of heaven. That's always the goal with Jesus. The kingdom of heaven. The kingdom of heaven should always be our top priority. And Jesus has made this clear, as we've been seeing through teaching through the book of Matthew and the other Gospels. To get into the kingdom of God, we have to have a heart that is right, a heart that is pure, a heart that is undefiled, and a heart that is focused on God and doing His will. Because you see, the Pharisees, they had all of this head knowledge. That's why they wore this comes from Deuteronomy 6, I believe, where Moses talked about the phylacteries being worn on their head and their forearms, and they would wear these big boxes, and the bigger the boxes on their forehead and on their forearms, the bigger the boxes, the more scriptures they knew. So they had all of this head knowledge. And like I said a while ago, they looked the part. They sounded the part. But Jesus would constantly expose these Pharisees and these religious leaders for what they really were. And that's frauds. They were frauds. They just looked the part. But their hearts were far from God. They thought they could follow the law and be in good standing with God. But what they don't understand is that if they break just one law, they're breaking all the laws, every one of them. James chapter 2 verse 10 says, for whoever keeps the whole law and yet stumbles at just one point is guilty of breaking all of it. Without Jesus, the bottom line is we don't stand a chance. And the Pharisees could not see this. They thought they were in good standing with God because they're trying to follow the law. But they needed Jesus. Now, there were some Pharisees that finally realized this, like Joseph of Arimathea and Nicodemus. They followed Jesus by night. They were disciples by night. So, if God has our hearts, then what's going to happen is we're going to try our very best to please God and not ourselves. And the Pharisees, when you read about the Pharisees and you study these Pharisees, that's all they were about was themselves. But God's heart is a heart that looks at others instead of self. Jesus is always just pouring himself out to others, meeting other people's needs, listening to others, taking time for others, healing others, casting out demons from others. He was, no matter how tired he was or what was going on, he always took time for others, even little children. And that's going to come up again in the next podcast. He was always giving, always thinking of others. And Jesus had told his disciples just a couple of chapters ago that we've already studied. And you can go back and listen to those podcasts as well. But he says, beware of the leaven of the Pharisees, meaning don't follow their examples because they are not right. Their hearts are not right in the eyes of God. And so I want to make this clear as possible as we wrap up this podcast today. The issue in Matthew 19 isn't divorce. The issue is the heart of man. Because we can fool people. It's easy to fool people. But we cannot fool God. He knows everything and anything that we do, we've ever done, and what we're going to do even before we do it. Because He knows all. He's omniscient. And the bottom line is either God has our hearts or He doesn't. And if God has our hearts, and this is the litmus test right here to know if God has our hearts or not. Because if God has our hearts, then we're going to be focused on others and not ourselves. But if God does not have our heart, we're going to be focused on self and we're going to take care of self. So try the litmus test. Take a survey of your life and take a survey and say, where is my heart? Am I more focused on others or am I more focused on myself and meeting my needs? That literally is the heart of the matter. God bless you. Thank you for listening today. And we'll finish up Matthew chapter 19 in the next podcast. God bless you. Keep grinding. Thanks for listening to the Grind It Podcast. If we could pray for you or encourage you in any way, please email us at thegrinditpodcast@gmail.com or you can text us at 865-418-2824. If you're watching on YouTube, please click like and subscribe and you'll be notified about new episodes. If you're listening on an app, leave us a 5-star review, but most importantly, share the Grind It Podcast with a friend. God bless you and remember, keep grinding.